Okay, so for today's agenda, apart from having these public forum, these monthly public forum discussions, the Autry team has also worked with two tribal groups that we have been working with, that we have a history, the Autry, I should say, has a history working with, so that we can start the conversations in a pretty advanced way. These are groups that we're actively working with right now, and we're starting to have conversations about NAGPRA in general. So folding in them as consultation members just made sense. So I'll share some of the feedback that we received so far. We've had about 5 meetings going over the workbook and going over the process of NAGPRA and where the libraries and archives can help improve relations, or where we have to consider certain policies. For those that have been following the development of the workbook, you'll notice that there's a different section breakdown based on these tribal consultation feedback, but also the feedback we've got here, and also trying to get that idea that this is a workbook. It's supposed to be a practical implementation resource that people can use fairly easily. And then in regards to today's discussions for access and researcher policies, just wanted to briefly go over the protocols or PNAAM sections related to access and research protocols. And then some questions to think about as we go into our breakout rooms. As always, just a little reminder of the ground rules of discussion, and we'll take a poll before we go to the breakout. The breakout session will be about a half an hour, and it looks like we've got a fairly small group, so that means that the breakout conversations might be a little bit more in depth. But as usual, I will break people out into rooms, and I'll stay in the main room as people start trickling in, if that happens. And then we all will convene back at noon for a recap. So some of the things that have come up have been like themes as we've had these tribal consultations with the groups that we've been working with. One of them from jump was the idea of a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, or a conversation not that relates to how the tribal consultation and development and relation and collaboration is to be conducted on both sides. So just coming right from jump, you know, getting on the same page with it. Maybe doesn't need to be as formal as a memorandum, but something to that extent where like everything is laid out on both sides. Like this is what as a tribal affiliate, from the tribal affiliate group, this is what we expect. This is what the types of communications, and then we can have a conversation from the institution side or the Autry side, for instance, of like what our timeline is, what our bandwidth, how we would like to proceed, and come together with this agreement. Also, a big thing that was mentioned too was just getting down the history, and the history could mean the historical relationship between the entity, the non-tribal affiliated entity or institution, and the tribal group, and knowing what the relationship is there. Have they been working with the institution for 30 years, 10 years, 5 years? Is this the first time? Also the history of the material. So if you're a library and archive and all you have is just library materials and archival materials, and maybe not the objects that are NAGPRA associated, knowing the provenance and the custodial history of some of those materials can still lead to great information as background research or any kind of research is conducted. So we talked about the ideas of provenance. And for those that are archivists and who have built finding aids, it kind of falls into that section of custodial history, but that maybe custodial history doesn't necessarily stop when it gets to the institution, but the custodial history or the provenance or the history of the object includes how it was created, how did it get to the hands of the person, or carrying the history of that object to, let's say it was an archival collection that was given to a university archive, then not just stopping there, but then continuing on. So it could just be a simple statement like, as this archive is part of our university, It's open to research for all. You know, it was part of it was a main focus for a curriculum for a class in, you know, 2010. So it's just following again the history of the object and the use of the object. And then research also came up. So again, not necessarily traditional research of looking at research materials about the particular objects or the particular tribe, but like having the institution who's developing these relationships also research within their institutional history, as well as research the different groups that they're going to be working with and what their issues are, what's the status of federally, non-federally recognized or current issues, if anything else, and who the people are that you'll be, who the people and groups are that you will be working with as well. Another thing was consultation. So there's definitely been, it's been evident that the definition and a conversation about consultation or a section about consultation be included in the work that really spells out what an ideal consultation could be. So not one size fits all, of course, as many people have commented on the workbook, but you know, what are the certain things to think about during the consultation process? And that tribal consultation is not only like the activities that happen in traditional consultation, but it's the environment. So what environment are they coming into? Are they coming into environment where they get lost in the parking lot and they can't find their way to the building? Is it, you know, is it an unwelcoming environment? Is an environment that has a lot of security issues where they have to get their bags checked and all of that? It also is documentation, so you can keep up the conversations throughout time, because consultation takes time, of course. As anybody who's been part of it knows, that it could take up years to decades to a generation or more. That the people component or the human component of the consultation needs some focus and consideration, where people need to just know where you're coming from, what they're coming from. I think Lillian was the one that said, because of, you know, because we the institution hold some of the historical documents and know, you know, what is going on with this material. We know so much about the particular tribe, but they don't know so much about our institution. They might know about our institution, but not about us, where we sit, and that we, being the archivist, the librarian, the NAGPRA consultant, the liaison, whatever you are, you know, how we sit in the role. And that consultation is continual, and it's like consultation kind of begets other consultation, but then timeline and bandwidth also needs to take consideration. So from all of the feedback that we've got from these public forums and the tribal consultations, one of the things I started playing with is adding a section to the workbook that you might have noticed when you were looking through it. So we have the introduction, which we talked about, and the introduction just describes the project activities, authorship notes, any historiography that should be put in there, as well as background information about the protocols and NAGPRA. The second step, or the second section, is something that is added, that I just added to see if that will work. And that's putting in the steps of the NAGPRA process. Then under each step, thinking about where the archive activation engagement might or might not happen, either by the repository or by the group, and then what kind of policies and procedures need to be considered, with the thought that they would go to the third section, which is the original section that we all have been reviewing in the past few months as resources and guides and examples on how to, you know, work with that particular NAGPRA process step. Again, we have titles. The rest of the sections are pretty much the same. So title, positions, and glossary. So the title, position, and glossary section was meant so that one, when a word like consultation or repatriation or custodianship, stewardship comes up, that we propose a definition that we can all like use as a jumping off point, maybe not agree with, and that's where your comments can come in really great, so that we know that we already have that in the, you know, documented. Like when we say consultation, this is what we're expecting, or these are the considerations. And the title of positions we thought we put in there to help institutions when they're hiring. So who are the team members, or when they're developing their team, let's say, not necessarily hiring, but when the team is being developed, what positions could be in play and what kind of roles can these positions take on, as also another way in which to like make sure that, you know, your blinds get a little bit more of an assist to your blind spots, especially those that are going in this for the first time. To think like, oh, there's a liaison position that's called da 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 da, and this particular, you know, Native communities communication person that their job is to just make sure communication flows freely, you know, not freely, but communication flows well back and forth between the various parties involved in the particular collaboration. And then of course a bibliography and additional resources. So a reminder that this workbook is to be a living document. It will be hosted where it will be updated. It could be updated and seen on a regular basis. So we expect, especially these two sections, to be updated on a regular basis. Right now, the plan is to host it on the Autry site. And maybe the Sustainable Heritage Network, but I will also take other suggestions. SAA, Society of American Archivists, you know, they are funding this grant, so it could be on that site too. Be more than happy to have that discussion, maybe in our May or June discussion. And then for right now, I'll hand it over to Christina, who's been giving some thought to the visuals and infographics that we could put in this workbook to be a little bit easier on the eye, for lack of a better phrase.
Good morning, everyone. So the first infographic that I'm working on, based on the feedback we got a couple open forum sessions ago, was we're trying to compare NAGPRA and PNAAM in a way that is visually easy to digest and just gives everyone, if you are new to this, you have a basic introduction to what these two things are and how they overlap and differ from each other. So I am working to determine the content of what that infographic would be, and then what the visual design of it would look like. And so I wanted to welcome any feedback from the rest of you, or any thoughts on what you think should be included. Right now, I just have a very basic start that outlines the fact that NAGPRA is a piece of federal law versus PNAAM, which is a set of professional best practices. One is, of course, enacted by the United States Congress. The other was endorsed by the Society of American Archivists, but they're both based on an understanding of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and both support that. So if anyone has thoughts, please feel free to drop them in the chat or message me directly.
Is that?
Yes. And yes, I'll turn it back to you for now, Lisa.
Okay, great, thank you.
Flowchart for the
yeah, and if you know of anybody that is interested in this project that also has visual design hobby or experience, we are more than happy to talk to that person. You know, workbook on a shoestring. So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but just as a reminder, if anything, of the protocols, if you do want to go back to it, does have these sections related to what we've been talking about in the past public forums. So they do have a section on accessibility and use, and I believe some of the verbiage for in this section, or some of the the intro part of this section, or the opening paragraph for this section, was also discussed last week in the ethics conversation and transparent language. So just as a reminder, there are some guidelines for action specifically dealing with access. They deal with ethics and legalities, as well as consultation. Also, require researchers and collection sources to provide copies of initial context. So a lot of, it might be materials about the collection as well as materials from the collection. And then determine the different types of resources and services Native communities want. There's things about fees and just other considerations in regards to impact and digitization, and then honor access and use restrictions required by tribes. So as you look at these guidelines, you might already have these considerations in place when developing your policies or the policies you would like to see. Then there is the Native American Research Protocol section in PNAAM that has action guidelines for both the Native community as well as archives and libraries. Again, I think these are some of the considerations that have been talked about in previous talks, as well as maybe in your own institution, in regards to consultation and how to work with researchers and reproduction rights and all of that, and permissions. The Native American Communities Guideline for Action, in thinking about that, those are actions for Native groups to take, but what can we in the non-affiliated entities or institutions, the museum, libraries, and archives, what can we do to help facilitate that? Can we host researcher training, like how to find material in our catalog? I don't know about you, but I'm sure we've all had that experience when we've gone to our own catalog or other entities' catalog. It can sometimes feel labyrinthy. So, helping with that. What we've also started to do is create a search strategy worksheet, so that the librarian, the reference librarians and archivists are documenting our strategy, which means where we're looking and what terms we're using, which is really important, and what that yielded. It does take a little bit of work, but I feel it's one of those things that could be put into the workflow. And then, the simplest things that the libraries, archives, museums, non-tribal affiliated institutions can do is just ask the question, right? Is like, so maybe we don't have the bandwidth to do a researcher lesson or info session, but we could just ask, right? What are the protocols? Are there researcher protocols? And a lot of these could be covered in that MOU or MOA, or that agreement discussion of expectations I talked about earlier. And then some things for the discussion topics. How does your institution define access? I know when I first got into the field of librarianship and being an archivist, access was kind of sort of black and white. It's like access for all or no access. If it's not access for all, it's not access. But of course, as you go through life and go through your career, you do notice the nuances and the areas of gray. And as PNAAM mentioned, like the philosophical and practical considerations associated with access. And then looking at access in that sort of prismatic way. Is there different levels of access? Or can access be seen on this scale? Is it that so far off of, providing access to something that has a strong copyright, like something related to Disney, for instance? And then, is there a need to have a separate researcher policy and access policy? Where are the differences? I know we have them organically at the Autry, but we've never examined that particular question of like where there are differences. There are differences. We just haven't really, articulated what they were. And then I didn't know quite how to phrase the fourth question, or the 1, 2, 3. Yeah, the fourth question. But it is a discussion about looking at the viability and value and the reputation, the viability and value of the research project, the reputation of the researcher. Like, does that come into play, and how do you strike that line if it does or if it doesn't? And then, of course, if you have any examples in your institution that you'd like to share, please make sure that you let the moderators know or add it to the comments of the workbook. I will get to, I think there's some chat going on, so I will get to that after the slide. So just another reminder of the ground rules. I think everybody's been fine. It's been great. We've had wonderful discussions, and I really appreciate, again, everybody's conscientiousness and graciousness in sharing your information and discussing these topics. Okay. Nothing. So Christina and Alejandra, is there anything in the chat that I need to address? It looks like there's, I think we're good.
We just had a couple people sharing graphics that they thought would be useful.
Nice. Yay.
There's also a question from Desiree. For you, Lisa, did I hear correctly? You consulted with 2 tribes. Which tribes?
Yeah, and you know what? That's something we haven't discussed internally, but Lilium, am I allowed to say which tribes? Okay, so Lilium, maybe Lilium, you can answer this question then.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, no, I think that you can, yeah, it's no secret. We can talk about it. The funding allows for us to just consult with a couple tribes in our Southern California area who have collections of the Autry that are connected to them. So we're currently consulting with Agua Caliente Band of Kuya Indians and with Pachanga Band of Luceña Indians right now. Ongoing discussions until the end of the grant.
Yes, and I do, yeah, and we're open
as well.
Yeah, and Desiree, we're open to have conversations with other tribes. One of the things that we wanted to make sure to consider is honorarium and stipends and that reciprocity. So that restricted us to choosing only 2. But we do plan to have a public forum discussion on April 15th for just tribal affiliated groups only. And then we are open with the availability of Zoom. We're also open to having other discussions. I have to say that, so I do release a poll after every discussion, and it's been heavily non-affiliated tribes coming to these public forums. So we've been working on ways, and also with like people who filled out the survey, we understand there has been a small representation from tribal affiliated groups. So we try to help that part out by having these tribal consultation, making sure our resources are authored by tribal members, or we pull examples of actual case studies that were tribal members were heavily involved in the collaboration, and then having other public forums that might be, that also might include them. But like I said, I feel that this conversation or this workbook will go on, and sometimes I feel people can react to something once it's a little bit more fully formed. So we are committed to continuing on discussions past June. So once it's out there and getting the feedback, we have the Zoom account till fall. So at least that we'll have at least one way of communicating. And I also am hoping to have this project be involved with ATOM as a working session in ATOM, which is another place in which we can get a wide amount of feedback. ATOM, the Association of Tribal Archives and Library and Museums Conference. But speaking of polls, before we go in breakout rooms, I will just launch this poll. Very simple. Again, it's about representation, and want to make sure that we know, we're aware, we're just aware who's been represented in these public forums and who's been providing their feedback.